Hi, Kimon.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Good to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you finally. I'm just going to do some greetings. Hello to everyone tuning in. We have a great interview with Kimon de Greef lined up for today. I'm Kate Nakamura, and I'm a news associate for the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, USA. It's an honor to be here, and I'm excited to have this conversation. Joining us today for our live interview series is Kimon de Greef. Kimon is a New York based freelance journalist from South Africa whose work has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Vice, National Geographic, and The Guardian. His recently published book entitled Poacher Confessions from the Abalone Underworld was nominated for the 2019 Alan Paton Award. Kimon, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your life. What brought you to the States? You're originally from South Africa. What has been your journey or experience so far?
Yeah, sure. I came to the States for two reasons. One was to come to NYU, just finishing up a master's there now in journalism. I was hoping for some more professional network and mentorship, particularly. Being in South Africa meant working on a lot of really interesting stories, but sometimes wanting a little guidance on how I might tackle something a little bigger or longer. Second reason for coming to the States is that my wife is American and she wanted to live here after being with me in Cape Town for 5 years.
Amazing. Glad that you're here now. How long have you been with the association? How do you feel the association helps foreign journalists such as yourself?
Well, the association made it possible for me to live here in my first year of studies. Graduate school's like horrifyingly expensive in the United States. And I was very fortunate to get a scholarship through the Foreign Correspondents Association I believe, in my first semester. Um, so I guess without that, I don't think I would be graduating right now.
Wow, fantastic. You're graduating right now?
Well, in about, I think I technically finish in like 5 weeks.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks.
So being from South Africa, this pandemic must have changed a lot for you. An article you wrote about South African burial traditions was published by the New York Times in July 2020. What has been your personal experience with continuing to write about your home country while being unable to return? What pushed you to pursue this story, and how did you go about writing it?
Wow. Well, it's been weird being away from home this year. I never thought that I would be going on 2 years without a visit when I came here. It's a combination of the pandemic and some visa stuff. Applying for a green card here also meant being unable to travel. And before that, I'd never lived away from home. I've traveled, but I've never lived away from home. So I'm not going to lie, it's been longer than I was hoping for. Um, Watching news and or just watching stories unfold back home and feeling unable in many cases to cover them has at times been frustrating, to the point where over the last few months I've actually tried to switch that radar off and just be like, I'm not there. I don't have a lot of value to add. And I'm going to focus on US based stories, which I've been doing. That said, it was really interesting doing the few pieces that I did. The burial piece in particular, I'd never really done that much remote reporting before. It was just, uh, I don't know, maybe 100+ hours on the phone with people, working out who the right people to talk to was, and also partnering with a really good local journalist who co-bylined the story with me, um, and kind of combining those two things. Having someone trusted on the ground was essential for a piece like that, though, because it was about end of life and ritual at end of life, which is quite a sensitive thing for people to be talking about. And I don't think it would have been possible to really capture some of that intimacy, being a stranger calling in from New York.
Yeah. How did you find your co-author?
Through a news organization that I used to work for quite a bit earlier in my career in Cape Town. They're called Ground Up News. They're a kind of social justice community oriented, grassroots online publication, and they do fantastic work. They cover stories, not really international audience stories, but cover stories that otherwise don't really make it into the South African press. And part of what Ground Up does is train up journalists. So through them, I partnered with Peter, who ended up Peter Lahanga, who ended up bylining the story with me. And yeah, everybody should read Ground Up News because I think they're fantastic.
Yeah, I will look that up definitely. So let's talk a little bit about your book, Poacher, Confessions from the Abalone Underworld. What led you to write a book about the South African black market trade in abalone? And what was the process of writing it?
So before I was a journalist, I was actually a conservation student in South Africa. I got a master's in conservation biology in 2012, 2013. And for that project, for my thesis, I began looking into abalone poaching. It's a massive criminalized industry in South Africa that also provides a means of income for people who are excluded from the formal economy. South Africa's up there with the world's least equal societies, and that falls very heavily along racial lines as a kind of overhang of apartheid. And so that thesis that I did was, in hindsight, very journalistic. It involved lots of interviews. I wanted to find out from people involved in the trade what their lives were like, where this had come from. The situation in certain fishing communities is that by far the most active local economy in many cases can be the illicit abalone trade, which is paying not only the guys diving, but people who are renting out freezer space for them to store the shellfish in, and drivers and young men who run around carrying the bags of abalone. And so after doing that project, I kind of realized that I wanted to do more of that kind of work. It was investigative journalism. It meant building trust with sources. And so that was my route into reporting. And over the years, I kept on writing about abalone because that's a big and really fascinating story. And when I think in 2016, I started thinking that I'd like to do a book about it, but I didn't know what the way in was. I'd met dozens of people, dozens of poachers, law enforcement officials. I had all these kind of disparate strands of a story. And the same week that I reached out to a book publisher about potentially doing something, even though I didn't really know what it would look like, a man approached the same publisher. He walked into their offices in Cape Town. He had a manuscript in a plastic packet, and he told them that he had written his life story in prison a decade ago when he had been locked up for poaching abalone. And so they mentioned to him, they said, well, funny enough, there's this writer who's also interested in this. And they mentioned me. He looked me up. We got together. We started talking. We chatted for about 3 or 4 months before we decided to combine forces. So that was also a co-byline. I don't co-byline all my stories, but that book ended up being myself, and we called him Shahud Abada. That's not his real name. So he was a co-author under pseudonym, where the bulk of the book was his story, and what I had to contribute to the project was writing about him as a character. He's a fascinating man, one of the most interesting people I've ever interviewed or spent time with, and also the kind of wider context about the bizarre rise of this black market in South Africa, feeding a luxury product to halfway around the world, to East Asia, where abalone is considered a status symbol. So that book came out finally in 2018.
Congratulations on that. Congratulations on being nominated for the award as well.
Thanks.
Speaking of poaching, it's considered quite a dangerous beat at times. What, besides your background, led you to cover such a beat?
Dangerous for me or dangerous for the poachers? Because I would say that the poachers have a more dangerous time of it than the writers do.
So you didn't experience any dangerous situations covering it?
Look, my way into the story has always been primarily that I want to hear from people involved in it why they do what they do. I have found over the years, I have gravitated towards stories um, about, I guess, illicit industries and wanting to get access to stories that perhaps haven't been put on the public record before. And over the years, I guess I've learned that many people respond well to someone saying, "Tell me about your life and why you do what you do." Um, I think in the abalone story, particularly, it's a story that's wrapped up in a lot of moral judgment for most people. Poaching is a bad thing. It's bad for the environment. It can be socially and economically harmful in the communities in which it takes place because it's run by gangs and cartels and so on. But going in from the beginning, I thought it was important to try and strip away that moral frame and just come and say, I want to know where this came from and why you do it and what it's like and what's it like to strap on a dive tank and get in the freezing ocean in the middle of the night with a torch on your head that you can only see 5 meters in front of you. What's it like to see sharks swimming by? And I guess people responded well to that. It's also important to move slowly in that kind of thing. To build relationships of trust with people, and then to also ask them to help me know if I'm getting myself into a situation that I maybe shouldn't be. But I've had no real safety issues doing this work. And frankly, a lot of my journalistic colleagues who cover protests or work in conflict zones do much more dangerous things, because what my work looks like is going to see someone with a pen and a cell phone to record maybe and having a conversation, you know?
Yeah, good insight.
But I will say that it's not stuff to be taken lightly and without building, if I would say to younger reporters not to rush, not to try and be the hero with the big blockbuster story. Sometimes ego can get involved. Sometimes people can want to look a certain way for doing a kind of reporting. I think early in my career, I quite liked the idea. I'm a bit embarrassed to think about it, but I think I quite liked the idea of like, I'm getting this access that other people haven't gotten. And if left unchecked, I think that can potentially become a little bit of a dangerous way to operate. And if one stays focused on the story and one's intention for telling the story because it's important, and finds those people who can make an introduction and iteratively work in closer towards the source, it can be completely safe. I just don't want to be on a broadcast saying, this kind of journalism isn't dangerous at all. I think it can be profoundly dangerous if you approach it in a not thoughtful enough way.
Yeah, it must have a lot to do with building trust and finding trusted sources. Are there any difficulties you've experienced in that?
Yeah, hugely. I mean, every story I do like this, people assume that I'm a cop or an undercover narc or something. So the number of times that I've been interrogated about that is dozens. In South Africa, there's racial baggage to being a white person walking into a fishing community of people of color and asking questions. So that one has to do some work to try and dismantle that persona that people assume. And I would say that the most dangerous thing that can happen is if people, once or twice I've run into like little, not really dangerous situations, but just uncomfortable situations where not enough people knew what I was doing, and then there can be a sort of rumor, and then you cross the road to go visit someone else, and there's a group of people on the corner, and they're like, "Hey, what the fuck are you doing here?" Excuse my language. And keeping people informed of my intentions and being quite direct and saying, "This is I'm a writer. This is what I'm doing." Not trying to do any undercover, sneaky stuff. That quite early on became apparent that being as direct as possible and having as many people as possible know why there's this random guy just hanging out on the weekends at these houses. And then when people ask the question, are you a cop? Especially people who break the law or skirt the law for a living, they tend to have a really good bullshit detector and a really good radar for reading somebody's intentions. And I guess every time someone's asked me that, I've just tried to be as honest and as straight and as earnest as possible. And in my experience, people can kind of tell, that I'm not here to trick them or pull the rug out from under their feet and bring the cops in 2 days later or something.
Yeah. Speaking of kind of difficult narratives to cover, you're from the appropriation of white sage from Native Americans to the struggle of Black South Africans. Your writing does cover a lot of difficult stories. Does your passion for covering poaching and environmental topics often lead you to Native or Indigenous stories, or do you seek those out first? What personal beliefs drive you to speak for those unspoken for?
I don't really know how to answer that. Having a conservation background, it's been a useful beat or at least departure point for looking for stories. And my experience of writing about poaching in South Africa, which is ostensibly a story of environmental crime, but the more work I did and the more people I spoke to, I came to understand it as a story of South Africa's past and difficult present. That it's a story about economics and politics and history and the ways in which the society that we have today does and does not serve people's interests. So I suppose looking for environmental stories and then trying to see what other stories they can tell has become one of the journalistic routines in my toolkit. I've been a freelancer for 7 years. Finding stories is really hard. Some people are really good at finding stories and they can kind of do it on command. I can't. I just sort of have to find them when I find them. And I suppose there are some thematic things that I'm interested in. So white sage was my wife's suggestion. She's actually better at finding stories than me a lot of the time. But she'd seen on Instagram that there were conversations about the misappropriation of sage, which is a sacred plant for especially tribes from Southern California historically, or tribal people from Southern California. And it's blown up as a kind of commercial product. What I liked about that story is that it's not just something that we can peg on some exotic culture in the East. A lot of poaching stories ultimately become quite reductive stories about Chinese people eat everything, and illegal trades and problematic resource chains are not restricted to the Far East. I mean, there's a bunch that culminate there, but white sage is used in yoga studios and meditation schools and all over the world. And the way that it's procured is almost completely unregulated. It's not criminalized like the abalone trade, but I was really fascinated to spend some time outside LA and on these nature reserves where they have in summer 20, 30 sage pickers coming in at a time and making off with as much sage as they can, getting chased by rangers. Sometimes they're flying helicopters over the top to catch the guys. And it was so different to what the stereotypical poaching story is, because the huge irony of this one is that people burn sage to meditate or connect with nature or be spiritual, and often with the best intentions. I know a lot of really wonderful people who burn sage and use it to calm down at the end of a radically stressful day. But there's this completely opaque and invisible supply chain connecting them back to often undocumented Central American workers who are in the San Bernardino Valley clipping sage for $5 a pound or something, because that's the best way that they've found to make a living. And it's very different to abalone. It's not nearly as lethal, it's not controlled by gangs, but there were enough points along that chain. And then speaking to native people in that area whose traditional practice of going to harvest sage, not to sell, but with great care and great intention to use in ceremony, and now finding that much more difficult because the places that they used to go have been clear cut to feed this international market. That just struck me as a story worth doing, and quite a sad picture of, I guess, global resource capitalism and the ways in which it can hurt people. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but it was a really interesting project. I was wrapping that up this time last year.
Thank you so much for that. I was really curious about, where you're coming from with all of these articles that I was reading. So thanks for that insight.
I don't know what the personal belief system is that drives me to do that. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that. It's stuff that I'm interested in and stuff that I feel like I can maybe add a little bit of value to as a journalist. So much journalism is like completely outside of my range. I can do breaking news, but I'm not very good at it. I stumble with politics unless it's South African politics. So it's just looking for where I feel like I have something a little bit more to offer, and leave the rest for my colleagues who do the other stuff better.
More about your articles about South Africa. Your article about the South Africa abalone black market, published by Hakai magazine, speaks on enduring economical hardships faced by South Africans exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic. Do you believe South Africa will ever be able to fully recover from the economic toll of the pandemic?
That's a hard question, and sort of like I said, maybe a little bit outside of what I feel like my expertise is. I will say that South Africa's economic situation was precarious before, and by all accounts, especially for the 50% of the nation who live below the poverty line, that situation has become substantially worse due to COVID. Due to the kind of insane realities of COVID vaccine inequality, the country's looking at only partial vaccination within the next few months. They're currently entering their third wave, and it makes me pretty afraid to see how things are. So no, I'm not filled with a huge amount of hope, but I'm also kind of accustomed as a South African over the last 2 decades to bad writing being on the wall, and there's a resilience to the people of South Africa. There's a free press. There's strong civil society. There are a few things that seem to keep it all together. So we'll see. I'm going home in a month for the first time, and I'm really excited and curious because, like I said, I haven't been there for almost 2 years, and I guess I'll have a little bit more of a felt sense of how things are. But my friends and family are there, and they're fine. They're not in the bracket of society that has suffered. So, it's a complicated country.
Definitely. It is a bit early for these complex questions, so let's do something a little bit lighter. What story are you most proud of?
Wow. I don't know.
I really think that would be an easy one.
I don't know. It feels like bragging about stories. The abalone work is just the thing that I've spent the most time on. I started interviewing for that in 2012 with no journalism experience, made a lot of really dumb mistakes, irritated a lot of sources, wrote some bad stories, kept at it. There are things I would do differently in the book, but I'm proud of the book. I think it adds something to the conversation about poaching abalone in South Africa, and more broadly, maybe around environmental concerns in countries such as South Africa, environmental concerns where they intersect with issues of social justice or historical dispossession. And I'm proud that I wrote the book with Shahud, that he had a platform to share his story, and that the book it was really strange to flip the kind of traditional journalist-source relationship a little bit and become co-authors. But it was an interesting experiment and feels a little bit less extractive than some journalism can. So I guess I'm also proud of the fact that we own it together, and that the story is as much his as it is mine.
Are there any upcoming projects that you'd like to talk about?
I'm working on something really exciting at the moment, and but I don't really think I can talk about it. And I don't mean to be funny. Um, and then I'm hoping to do a bit of stuff when I go back to South Africa. But it's a little vague. I'm finishing up school. I'm working on this big project that I'm going to keep a little under wraps for now, and trying to work out what to do after graduating, which isn't entirely clear. I think I'll probably freelance for at least the next bit and work out how to move between South Africa and the States without messing up my green card application.
Is there anything that you would like to say on behalf of the association or to other association members?
I don't feel justified to speak on behalf of the association. I would strongly encourage young journalists coming to study in the United States to put themselves forward for the AFC scholarships. Studying at grad school has been really productive and useful for me. But the state of journalism is such that I think it's unwise to go into too much debt if you can avoid it, just because the reality is that there isn't an abundance of jobs waiting, and what jobs there are don't typically pay a huge amount of money. I gather that American students are kind of more normalized to the idea of going into large debt. But when I looked at the sums when I was coming here, and realistically what I might earn afterwards, it seemed like pretty unwise. So scholarships are critical, and I can't emphasize enough how impossible this whole New York sabbatical school adventure thing would have been without that support. So I'm not speaking on behalf of the association. I'm more speaking to them and just saying thank you. And to students looking to do this kind of thing, there's support if you go looking for it, and it can make a really big difference.
Really good advice. Thank you so much, Kimon. I'll let you enjoy the rest of your morning.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us and having the patience to do this.
Such a pleasure.
So good to meet you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Cool. Thank you very much. Have a good one yourself.
Thank you.
Ciao.